good day to talk about CB radios, and I don't know what brought it to the forefront for me here recently. I was shopping for a new CB radio, and I don't know why, but I got the bug. But anyway, the first CB radios were developed for the U.S. military over in Europe. So during World War II, so they could communicate short distances with the other troops, and that was the advent of the CB radio. And after World War II, the FCC in the United States decided that it would be okay to release this technology to the public. So, like by 1946 or 47, they were marketing CB radios to the American public. And probably the group that caught on the most were the truck drivers to jump on the bandwagon and grab these things. Now remember, 1946, 1947, that's 10 years even before the interstate system was completed. So what you have here is gypsy truckers running 2-lane back roads and having a need to communicate with one another as to what the chicken coops were doing, what the cops were doing, what the DOT was doing, and what the weather was doing, stuff like that. So it became an essential form of communication for truck drivers in the late 1940s. Well, by the time the 1960s came along, everybody and their dog had caught on to CB radios, and families with camper vans were getting them, and just four-wheelers going back and forth to work were getting them. But they were a great tool for their time, but particularly for the truck driver. They were relatively inexpensive back then. You could go to Radio Shack and set yourself up with a radio and an antenna for about $50. So, the cost, it was well affordable back then. And the cost hasn't particularly risen that much today, unless you're going to specialize into a big ham radio or something like that. But and then the trucker movies started to come out, like Smokey and the Bandit and Convoy. And those guys were all using CBs in the movies, and that really spurred the popularity of the CB radio. So they became a hot item by the 1960s, and by God, everybody was getting them. The early CBs, the first CBs were 23-channel CBs, and that was all the channels, the wave frequencies that the FCC would initially allow. And my very first CB was a 23-channel Radio Shack. Set it up myself in about 10 minutes. It was easy to do, and it was fun. But the range was pretty limited on the early ones. You could talk about a mile on a good day, back and forth. But everybody knew at that point already that they were going to want bigger radios with more channels. And it wasn't long before the FCC relented and came out with what we recognize today as the 40-channel CB radio. And CB shops began springing up in the truck stops. This was a new thing because the truck drivers had them, they loved them, they wanted to get better performance out of them. And some of the best CB shop mechanics that I ran into in my days were guys out of the U.S. military that had retired or stepped back or for whatever reason, but they'd learned their trade all about radios and communication in the military. So those guys were the best guys to set up your CB radio so it could really talk. So the CB shops really came into being, and they could take a 4-watt radio, which is what the FCC set as the limit for power outage, and they could boost them to about 7 watts just by turning a couple of screws. It didn't take them very long, and by God, all of a sudden we'd gone from talking 1 mile to now we could talk about 5 miles. And then the boot came out, the power boosters for the CB radios. I still have my original one here that I bought years ago. It's a 250 Texas Star, and 250 indicating the wattage that it could put out. So by the time they peaked and tuned your radio, you could talk for miles with one of these things. And these boots had what was called a push-pull. So you could send farther, but but you could also receive farther, and it was a great boost to the range of the CB radio. They had power mics that came out. A lot of them were just battery operated, like a couple of small AA batteries built right into the microphone, but they could boost the signal. That became another toy that they had. And you could started to get stuff like Roger Beep, which I thought was completely annoying. I never got that. But you could get talk back and echo. I like the talk back feature because you could hear how you sounded and tune your radio accordingly. But all sorts of stuff started coming out, and the popularity just kept growing and growing. Sideband. Then they introduced sideband on the 40-channel radios, and that virtually tripled the number of channels you could get. You had to use a clarifier to bring in the channels, the sideband channels well, and the sound wasn't great, but it was something. And there were enough channels on there that you could go for privacy. You could dial one of your friends on a sideband channel and not get interrupted or walked on. So that was kind of handy. So just about the time that everybody has a CB radio, and everybody has a peaked and tuned CB radio, and most guys have a boot, along come what we called the big radios, the 10-meter radios. Basically, they were a portable ham radio. And I had gone from the original Radio Shack with the 23 channels to when Cobra came out, and you could get Cobras and Uniteds in the truck stop. So my first one after the Radio Shack was a 25-channel LTD Cobra. Then I graduated to the 29 LTD Cobra, which I had tuned and peaked, combined it with the boot there. And here's my old 29 Cobra LTD. Still got it. It's not the same one I have mounted in the truck. This was one that I literally wore out and replaced it with another LTD 29. But great radios, and you didn't have to finicky dial with them all the time. They were well tuned. But then out came the big ham radios, the big 10-meter radios. And if you were a large car or a chicken trucker, man, you just had to have one because they talked so much better. So I went out and spent, I think it was about $500 back then, on a President 2510 was my big radio, my radio choice. But you could also buy the big radios, the big 10 meters from Stryker or Galaxy. But as I say, I had a 2510, and it had a frequency counter, so you had unlimited number of channels. So what you would do with your friends was establish a channel up or above or below channel 19 that you would always talk on, and you would just dial down to that particular frequency. It was almost impossible for anyone else to find it. And with the boots and the 10 meters, you could talk for miles. I could talk when I was running across I-80 through Wyoming. If the skip was running right, I could talk to a guy down in Louisiana called Treetop, and he had his antenna up in a tree, literally. And we could talk for a few hours before I lost him, before I got into the hills into Utah. But thousands of miles range if the skip was running right.